It's a video. You saw a video. You were
Yeah, my daughter, right.
Yeah.
I had my daughter for the weekend, and we went to her sister-in-law's house, and I proceeded to get drunk. And little I know they had a tripod camera on me. I was clueless. But anyway, shooting me the whole night. So the next day I got up, and my sister-in-law showed me the video. It was like horrific. And my daughter was said a couple of things that crushed me. That was it. And that got me to rehab.
He was a baseball Hall of Famer, the biggest drunkard in a sport that had plenty of them. And somehow, against every odd stacked against him, he survived long enough to become one of the most beloved figures the game has ever seen. Dennis Eckersley, a man with 197 wins, 390 saves, and a first ballot trip to Cooperstown. A man who literally invented a word that baseball still uses every single day. But behind the legend, behind the mustache and the sidearm delivery, and the electric closer role that redefined an entire position, there was a life being quietly torn apart. Betrayal from inside his own home. A brother sent to prison for 40 years? A drinking problem so severe that his own daughter once looked him in the eye and told him she did not even know who he was. And then, just months after his emotional retirement from broadcasting in 2022, news broke that his adopted daughter Alexandra had been living in a tent in the woods since 2018, gave birth alone in roughly 15-degree weather on Christmas night, and was arrested for abandoning that newborn. How does a Hall of Famer end up connected to that kind of pain? That is exactly what we are going to answer today. Before we go deeper, if you want more real stories like this, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype. It really helps. Because the truth of Dennis Eckersley is not a simple story about a drunk who got sober and made it big. It is a story about how addiction travels, how it echoes across generations, how it can take a man who threw no-hitters and won MVP awards and still leave a trail of wreckage through everyone closest to him. Some people look at a career like his and see only the highlight reel, the saves, the strikeouts, the Cooperstown speech. But there is another version of this story running parallel to all of that, and it is darker and more honest, and it deserves to be told in full. The applause never stopped, the accolades kept coming, and all the while the private story was accumulating damage that no trophy could address. Let us start at the beginning, because where Eckersley started matters. He was drafted by the Cleveland Indians in the third round of the 1972 MLB draft. He was a California kid. He had dreamed of wearing the uniform of the Giants or the Dodgers, teams closer to home, teams that felt like they belonged to his world. Cleveland was not that. Cleveland was a cold industrial city with a struggling ball club, and a teenager from California did not want any part of it. But there was a silver lining buried in that disappointment. A weak organization meant a fast path to the major leagues, and Dennis Eckersley was talented enough to sprint through it. By age 20, in 1975, he had already established himself as one of the best young pitchers in the American League. He earned Sporting News American League Rookie Pitcher of the Year honors after going 13-7 with a 2.60 ERA. He had long, unstyled hair, a thick mustache. He looked like he belonged to that mid-1970s era of baseball, the era that wore its recklessness like a badge. Fans in Cleveland loved him immediately. He was the kind of player that made people buy tickets just to watch him warm up. The game came easily to him in those years. Too easily, maybe, because when things come easily, you rarely build the internal tools to handle when they stop. Success at that age, arriving that fast, has a way of convincing a young man that the difficulty other people talk about simply does not apply to him. Eckersley had every reason to believe that, and that belief would cost him later. On May 30th, 1977, he threw a no-hitter against the California Angels. That was the peak of his Cleveland days. A perfect performance. A moment that should have been the launchpad for something even bigger. He was 22 years old. He was already one of the most exciting pitchers in the league. He had the look, the arm, the command, and the crowd behind him. From the outside, it appeared that nothing could stop what was coming next. But while Eckersley was building his professional reputation on the mound, his personal life was being destroyed somewhere far more private, inside his own house. His first marriage was to a woman named Denise. He had married her young at 18 years old. They were together through his climb through the minor leagues, through his arrival in Cleveland, through the early years of his career. Young marriages in professional baseball carry a specific kind of pressure. The travel, the uncertainty, the long stretches of absence, the sudden money, the attention that follows a promising player. Most relationships struggle under that weight even when nothing goes wrong, and then something went very wrong. In 1977, a Cleveland teammate named Rick Manning suffered a back injury. Manning was considered a high-priority prospect for the organization. He was the kind of player the Indians believed was going to be a cornerstone of their future. He was also, at that moment, a close friend of Dennis Eckersley. So in a gesture culture of friendship and generosity, the Eckersleys invited Rick Manning to stay in their home while he recovered from his injury. What happened next became one of the most notorious clubhouse scandals in baseball history. Manning and Denise began an affair, right there inside the home that Eckersley had provided as an act of friendship. The betrayal was complete. A teammate, friend, a wife, all three conspiring against him in the one place that was supposed to be his sanctuary. Think about what that does to a person. Not just the heartbreak of a marriage ending, not just the humiliation of being publicly wronged, but the specific violation of having your trust weaponized. He opened his door out of kindness, and the person he let in walked through his life and took what he wanted. That kind of wound does not close quickly. For some people, it never fully closes. And for Eckersley, it did not close. It just went underground, where it kept working on him in ways that would not become fully visible for another decade. The damage was not just personal. It rippled out into the organization itself. The Cleveland clubhouse was flooded with rumors. The press described it in ugly terms. The stadium, nicknamed the Wigwam, became a place of embarrassment and tension. The Indians' front office, led by general manager Phil Segui, faced a decision that had nothing to do with baseball strategy and everything to do with damage control. The situation had even drawn comparisons in the press to a 1973 Yankees scandal involving two pitchers who had infamously swapped families. The Manning situation carried that same surreal, almost unbelievable quality. This was not a quiet domestic dispute. This was a story that people were talking about openly, inside and outside the organization. They ran the numbers, and the numbers were cold. They weighed Eckersley's pitching career against Manning's potential as a Gold Glove center fielder, and they chose Manning. They decided that keeping Manning in Cleveland made more baseball sense than keeping the man whose home his teammate had destroyed. On March 30th, 1978, Dennis Eckersley and Fred Kendall were traded to the Boston Red Sox. For Eckersley, it was described as a crushing blow. He was personally devastated. He had just thrown a no-hitter for this organization. He had given them everything he had, and they rewarded his loyalty by removing him from the equation to protect the man who had betrayed him. The cruelty of that calculation is almost difficult to absorb. He was the victim, and he was the one who got moved. Manning, for his part, never became the player the Indians had bet on. He retired in 1987 without ever achieving the stardom they had gambled away Eckersley to protect. Later in life, Eckersley talked about how he dealt with it. He channeled it. He turned the humiliation into fuel. He used the chip on his shoulder as a psychological engine to keep going. It worked, at least on paper. He went to Boston and won 20 games in 1978. But channeling that kind of pain into performance does not make the pain disappear. It buries it, and buried pain has a way of finding something to attach itself to. For Eckersley, that something was alcohol. It did not announce itself all at once. It settled in quietly, disguised as celebration, disguised as the normal culture of a baseball clubhouse in that era, where drinking was woven into the fabric of the sport so completely that it was almost impossible to see where normal ended and problem began. The move to Boston was a fresh start on the surface, but the years between 1980 and 1984 told a different story. His fastball began to lose velocity. His ERA climbed. His personal life continued to fray. In 1980, he posted a 12-14 record with a 4.28 ERA, and while he was still the nominal ace of the Red Sox rotation, the numbers signaled something deeper. He admitted later that his personal life was in complete disarray during this period. The drinking that would eventually consume him was already taking root. It was quiet then, hidden, manageable, or so it seemed from the outside. But alcoholism rarely announces itself loudly at first. It seeps in slowly, filling the gaps left by everything that has gone wrong. And by this point, there were a lot of gaps. The betrayal, the trade, the failed marriage, the career that was supposed to keep climbing but had started to plateau. Each one left a space, and alcohol filled every single one. On May 25th, 1984, the Red Sox traded Eckersley to the Chicago Cubs in exchange for Bill Buckner. The Cubs were chasing their first postseason appearance in decades, and Eckersley gave them a boost in the second half of 1984, winning 10 games and contributing to their division title. For a brief moment, it looked like another professional resurrection was underway, but this time there would be no resurrection. Not yet, not in Chicago. Because by the time he arrived with the Cubs, the drinking had stopped being a quiet background problem and had started to become the whole story. The years between 1984 and 1986 in Chicago were, by his own account, a crossroads. The word he used was spiraling. He said he was spiraling out of control personally. He admitted he was living in a state of complete denial about his alcohol abuse. By 1986, the spiral was visible in the stats. He went 6-11 with a 4.57 ERA. But the numbers were not the real problem. The numbers were just symptoms. The real problem was that Dennis Eckersley, one of the most gifted pitchers of his generation, had become someone who could not function without alcohol. The unresolved trauma of the Manning betrayal, the years of suppressing pain through performance, the weight of competing at the highest level while carrying everything he had never dealt with, all of it had compounded into a chronic dependency that was eating him alive. And he was telling himself every day that it was fine, that it was under control, that he was not that bad. He had a reason to believe he was not that bad, because he had a reference point for bad. His older brother Wallace, known as Wally, was showing him every day what bad actually looked like. The two brothers had grown up in a household defined by competition. Their father pushed them hard from an early age. They were close in that particular way that brothers who compete constantly become close, always measuring themselves against each other. But the same predispositions for addiction that ran through their family had taken completely different forms in each of them. Dennis was fighting it even if he did not know it yet. Wally had already lost. And the distance between those two outcomes was not as wide as Dennis wanted to believe. By 1983, while Dennis was still starting for the Red Sox, Wally was living on the streets. Dennis described him plainly. He called him a hobo. He talked about his brother having a purple face, being a complete mess, being someone whose life had been thoroughly consumed by alcohol. And as painful as that was to watch, Dennis used it as a way to stay in denial. He would look at Wally and tell himself, I am not that bad. That is the insidious logic of addiction. It always finds someone worse to point to, always finds a way to make the current level of destruction feel manageable by comparison. So Dennis kept drinking and kept pointing at Wally and kept telling himself the story that he was fine. The mirror was right there in front of him. He just refused to see himself in it, because seeing yourself in that mirror means accepting something you are not ready to accept. And Dennis Eckersley was not ready, not yet. The story fell apart in a living room late in 1986, after the season had ended. His wife Nancy and his daughter Mandy had done something that required a specific kind of courage. They had recorded him on videotape while he was intoxicated, and then they sat him down and made him watch it. For a man who had spent his entire adult life being watched, being evaluated, being judged by crowds and coaches and managers and reporters, nothing had prepared him for this. Seeing himself through the eyes of the people who loved him most was, in his own words, the ugliest thing he had ever seen. There was nowhere to hide from it, no way to rationalize it, no convenient comparison to point at, just his own face on a screen, and the face looking back at him was not someone he recognized. And then his daughter said the words that pierced through everything. She told him she did not even know her dad. Not that she was angry with him, not that she was disappointed. She said she did not even know who he was. He had been present in body and absent in every way that mattered. A professional athlete celebrated by millions of strangers, completely invisible to the child sitting in the same room. That moment led directly to a rehabilitation clinic in January 1987. Eckersley has talked about this turning point with a clarity and conviction that is hard to miss. He said getting sober saved his life. He said the day he started rehab was the day his life actually changed. More than the Hall of Fame, more than the MVP award, more than anything that happened on a baseball field. Sobriety gave him something that performance never could. It gave him the ability to actually be present, to feel what was happening, to face it without numbing it. The clinic was not a pause in his story. It was the beginning of the only version of his story worth telling. Everything before January 1987 was a man running from himself. Everything after was a man finally turning around. He entered the 1987 season clean and sober, and in April of that year, the Cubs traded him to the Oakland Athletics. He was 32 years old. He was newly sober. He had not been dominant in years, and the Athletics manager Tony La Russa and pitching coach Dave Duncan initially saw him as a setup man, a long reliever, someone to fill innings, not close games. But then an injury to closer Jay Howell created a vacancy, and Eckersley stepped into it with an efficiency that surprised everyone, including himself. The move from starting to closing was not just tactical, it was psychological. Eckersley had always talked openly about his anxiety, about his profound fear of failure. As a starter, that anxiety had 9 innings to breathe and build. It was a slow burn that wore him down over the course of a game, over the course of a season, over the course of years. But as a closer, the pressure was completely different. It was explosive and immediate. He described it as jumping out of a plane, a burst of intensity, and then it was over. His sobriety gave him the mental clarity to channel that nervous energy rather than drown in it. The same emotional intensity that had fueled his drinking now fueled something else entirely. And what came out of that channel was one of the most dominant runs in relief pitching history. Between 1988 and 1993, he saved at least 33 games every single season. In 1990, his ERA was 0.61. That number is not a typo. It is not a rounding error. It is one of the most statistically freakish single-season performances a relief pitcher has ever produced. In 1992, he won both the American League Cy Young Award and the American League MVP, which almost never happens for a relief pitcher. The Oakland dynasty of those years had many contributors, but the man closing games out was Eckersley, and he was doing it with a precision that made hitters look helpless. He was 37 years old when he won that MVP, sober for 5 years. A man who had been written off by multiple organizations, who had crashed out of Chicago with a 4.57 ERA and a reputation as a fading talent, was now the best relief pitcher in the world. If that were the whole story, it would be one of the greatest comeback narratives in sports history. But before any of that dominant run truly settled into the history books, there was October 15th, 1988, Game 1 of the World Series. Oakland against the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Athletics had won 104 games that season. They were the dominant force in baseball. Eckersley had led the American League in saves with 45. He was untouchable. And then Kirk Gibson limped to the plate. Gibson had been battling injuries all season. He had received injections in the clubhouse just before this at-bat. He could barely walk. He was using his bat like a crutch on his way to the plate. Nobody in that stadium believed he was actually a threat. Eckersley certainly did not believe it. There was a reason Gibson had not even been in the starting lineup that night. He was too hurt to play a full game. The expectation from everyone watching was that Eckersley would dispatch this broken-down hitter in 3 or 4 pitches and the game would be over. The count worked to 3-2, 8 pitches total, and Gibson stood in there, waiting. He had seen a scouting report from a coach named Mel Didier. The report said that Eckersley had a tendency to throw a backdoor slider on full counts to left-handed hitters. Gibson was left-handed. Gibson waited, the pitch came, and using only his upper body, driving through the ball with everything he had left in him, Gibson sent it over the right field fence. What followed was one of the most replayed moments in baseball history. Gibson pumping his fist while limping around the bases, barely able to run but doing it anyway because the emotion was carrying him. The Dodger Stadium crowd losing its mind. And in the dugout and on the mound, Eckersley stood there, absorbing something he later called a disaster. One pitch, one at-bat, one man who could barely walk, and the best closer in baseball had just served up one of the most iconic home runs the sport has ever seen. But something else came out of that moment too. In the post-game interview, Eckersley reached for words to describe what it felt like to be the pitcher who threw that pitch, and he came up with a phrase. He called it a walk-off piece. He explained that, as the pitcher, you throw the ball and then you have to walk off the mound. You have to turn around and leave. The walk-off was born from the devastation of the losing pitcher, not the celebration of the winning team. That is the origin of a word that baseball uses every single game to this day, and it came from one of the darkest professional moments of his life. Oakland won the 1989 World Series. Eckersley earned his ring, but in that same year, on April 25th, 1989, his brother Wallace was found guilty in a Colorado courtroom. Second-degree kidnapping, attempted murder, aggravated robbery. He was sentenced to 40 years in a Colorado prison. The same year Dennis was closing out the World Series against the San Francisco Giants, Wally was beginning 4 decades behind bars for a violent crime that grew from the same addiction Dennis had barely escaped. Dennis described it with a kind of heartbroken honesty. He talked about the magic that had stayed with him being missing in his brother, as if some invisible variable had sorted their fates, and he had no explanation for why it had landed the way it did. And there is no clean explanation. There never is. What there is the image of 2 brothers standing at the same crossroads, facing the same disease, and arriving at completely different destinations. That contrast is one of the most painful threads in this entire story. 2 brothers, same upbringing, same predispositions, same disease. One got sober in January 1987. One went to prison in April 1989. A 2-year window separating redemption from ruin. It makes you wonder every time you hear about it what the difference actually was. And the honest answer is that nobody really knows. Addiction does not follow a script. It does not sort people by talent or effort or love. It takes what it takes and leaves what it leaves. Wally never got the videotape intervention. Maybe nobody sat him down and made him see himself clearly. Maybe the people around him tried and he could not hear it. Maybe the same disease that Dennis barely survived had already moved too deep in Wally by the time anyone thought to reach for him. That uncertainty is part of what makes his story so heavy. There is no villain to point to in Wally's ruin, just a disease that moved faster than the people who might have helped him. Eckersley played professional baseball through 1998. When his playing career ended, he eventually moved into broadcasting. Starting in 2003, he joined the New England Sports Network, NESN, as an analyst for Red Sox games. His style in the booth was the same as his style on the mound. Direct, unfiltered. He said what he saw, which sometimes frustrated the players he was talking about, but made fans love him. He became an institution in New England, and a large part of that had to do with his partnership with Jerry Remy, a former teammate and longtime Red Sox presence who had been covering the team for decades. The two of them built something real in that booth. 2 men who had been through the grind of professional baseball for most of their lives, sitting together and talking about the game they had both loved and been damaged by. Remy had his own health struggles over the years, battling cancer repeatedly, and Eckersley was a constant presence through all of it. The friendship was genuine and visible, the kind that does not perform for the camera because it does not need to. But the booth did not stay a sanctuary for long. In 2013, Eckersley was called upon to fill in for Remy after Remy's son Jared was arrested and charged with murdering his girlfriend, Jennifer Martell. The Remy family called it a senseless and tragic act. They said they were devastated. Eckersley stepped into the booth and held it together while his partner was absent, dealing with something no parent should ever have to face. The weight of that season, sitting in that chair with Remy's absence filling the space beside him, is hard to imagine. But Eckersley showed up every day and did the job. That kind of loyalty and steadiness tells you something about who he had become in his sober years. The chaos that once defined him had been replaced by something more solid. Jerry Remy died in October 2021, and his death was a factor in Eckersley's decision to step away from broadcasting in 2022. He said it plainly. He said it all adds up. The loss of Remy, the travel, the years. He wanted to be present for his grandchildren in a way he had not been present for his own children when they were young. That detail carries weight. Even in retirement, even after decades of sobriety, he was still reckoning with the cost of who he had been during the drinking years, still trying to pay back a debt to the people he had been absent for. His final broadcast was October 5th, 2022, at Fenway Park. He stood in the booth and cried. Both the Red Sox and the visiting Tampa Bay Rays came out to salute him. It was one of those rare moments where a sports figure's departure actually earns the ceremony. He had given that booth everything he had for almost 2 decades, and when he walked out of Fenway that night, he was walking away from the last structured role of his public life. And then, just months after that emotional goodbye, on Christmas night 2022, Alexandra was arrested in Manchester, New Hampshire. The details were shocking in the way that only real life can produce. Alexandra, his adopted daughter, had been homeless and living in a tent since 2018. That is 4 years in a tent. 4 years without stable housing while her father was in a broadcast booth being celebrated as a legend of the game. She had been living in those conditions when she gave birth to a baby boy in approximately 15-degree weather. She was accused of abandoning the newborn and of misleading authorities about where the child was. She was arrested on December 25th, 2022, Christmas Day. The detail of the date sits there and does not let you look away from it. The Eckersley family released a statement, and the words in it were devastating in their own right. They said they were utterly devastated. They said they were in complete shock. They said they had no prior knowledge of the pregnancy. And they said something else that reframed the entire situation for anyone paying attention. They revealed that Alexandra had suffered from severe mental illness her entire life, that she had diagnoses of mental health and developmental issues dating back to childhood, that the family had done their very best to get her help, including hospitalizations and residential programs. But once she turned 20, she was legally free to make her own decisions. The law has a cutoff. The law says that at a certain age, a parent cannot force treatment anymore, no matter how clearly that treatment is needed. And Alexandra had exercised her legal right to refuse it, and the consequences had unfolded in a tent in the New Hampshire woods in the middle of winter. The family's statement also pointed to something that goes beyond their specific situation. New Hampshire's mental health system once had 2,500 inpatient psychiatric beds. By the time of Alexandra's crisis, there were fewer than 200 for a population of 1.2 million people. The gap between what the system is supposed to provide and what it actually provides is the size of a canyon, and Alexandra fell through it. The family had tried, they had pushed, they had used every resource available to them, and it had not been enough, not because they failed, but because the infrastructure required to support someone with Alexandra's level of need simply did not exist in adequate supply. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It means the outcome was not inevitable because of something the family did wrong. It was the result of a broken system meeting a severe illness in a person who had reached an age where no one could legally intervene. The legal process moved slowly. Her trial concluded on August 2nd, 2024, with a split verdict. She was found guilty of reckless conduct and falsifying evidence. Then on October 17th, 2024, the judge handed down sentencing. He gave her an 18-month suspended sentence. He specifically cited the significant likelihood that putting Alexandra in prison would destroy the stability and progress she had built since her arrest. He looked at what she had managed to accomplish in the intervening 2 years and decided that incarceration would undo it. That is not nothing. That is a judge looking at the full picture and making a choice rooted in what might actually help, rather than what satisfies a punishment framework. The defense had argued throughout the trial that Alexandra did not know she was pregnant, that she was in a medical emergency, and that a man named George the Burge had told her the baby had no pulse. Whether the jury fully accepted that argument or not, the sentencing reflected a recognition that this woman's story was more complicated than a simple crime. Since the sentencing, Alexandra has remained sober. She attends therapy regularly. She was reunited with her son, Teddy. She is living with her mother in Massachusetts. Those are real steps, real progress. But none of it erases the image of a woman alone in a tent in the woods in 15-degree temperatures, giving birth by herself because a mental health system and a legal framework could not find a way to reach her before it came to that. Progress in the aftermath does not rewrite what happened. It just means the story is still going, and that right now, it is going in a better direction. Pull back and look at the whole picture, and what you see is a pattern that runs like a current through everything. Betrayal in 1978, addiction through most of the 1980s, a brother imprisoned in 1989, a broadcast partner's family shattered in 2013, a daughter in crisis in 2020, 2022. These are not random events. They are connected by the same thread, which is what happens when pain does not get addressed, when systems fail, when the people around you love you but cannot reach you, and when the gap between public success and private suffering grows wide enough to swallow everything. The Hall of Fame career sits on one side of that gap. Everything else sits on the other. Dennis Eckersley gave the English language a word: walk-off. He coined it in the immediate aftermath of one of the worst moments of his professional life. He was trying to describe what it feels like to be the losing pitcher in a game-ending moment. You throw the ball, you watch it leave the park, and then you walk off the mound. You turn your back on it. You leave. That is the only option. You cannot unhit the home run. You cannot go back. You walk off and you try again. He did not know when he said it in 1988 that he was also describing his entire life. Every disaster in his story has required the same response: walk off, recover, try again. Not because the disaster did not hurt, not because the damage was not real, but because standing still in the middle of it is not an option. He walked off from the Manning betrayal. He walked off from the Cleveland organization that chose his teammate over him. He walked off from alcohol in January 1987. He walked off from a near-fatal spiral in Chicago and reinvented himself in Oakland. He walked off from the 1988 World Series with his head down and came back the next year to win a championship. He walked off from the broadcast booth with tears in his eyes and more grace than most people could manage. He walked off from every disaster his life produced, and then he turned around and tried again. That is the actual through line of his story. Not the saves, not the MVP, not Cooperstown. The willingness to keep walking off even when the damage was personal and deep and had nothing to do with a baseball game. But walking off does not mean the disaster goes away. Wallace is still whoever he became after decades in a Colorado prison. Alexandra still spent 4 years in a tent. The mental health system still has fewer than 200 beds for 1.2 million people. The things you walk away from do not disappear. They follow you. Sometimes they follow the people closest to you and find them instead. The heaviest part of Eckersley's legacy is not the Gibson home run or the 1988 series loss. It is the knowledge that sobriety, as powerful as it was for him personally, could not inoculate the people around him against the same forces that had nearly destroyed him. Recovery is individual. The people you love still have to find their own way to the door. The Hall of Fame induction happened. The 390 saves are real. The 1992 MVP is real. The no-hitter is real. But the greatest decision Dennis Eckersley ever made happened in a living room in late 1986 when he sat down and watched a videotape of himself and for the first time could not lie his way out of what he saw. And then he walked into a clinic in January 1987 and he chose to stay. That choice did not fix everything. It did not save Wally. It did not prevent Alexandra's suffering. It did not guarantee that the people he loved would be okay. But it gave him the ability to be present for what came next. And being present for the pain rather than numbing it is the difference between endurance and collapse. He chose endurance over and over again. Across 4 decades of setbacks and losses and grief, he chose to keep walking off and keep showing up. He said something once in a talk about sobriety that has stayed with the people who heard it. He talked about starting to like himself again. After years of self-destruction, after everything he had been through, the goal was not fame or success or a Hall of Fame plaque. The goal was to start to like himself again, to get to a place where the reflection was someone he could live with. That is a quiet and profound kind of ambition. Not to be great, not to be celebrated, just to be able to look at yourself without flinching. He got there. It took a videotape and a clinic and decades of daily choices, but he got there. And the fact that he got there, after everything that tried to stop him, is the only genuinely hopeful thing in an otherwise heavy story. Alexandra is sober. She is in therapy. She has her son Teddy back. She is building something from almost nothing, which is exactly what her father did in January 1987. Maybe the one thing that travels across generations alongside the addiction is the possibility of recovery. It is not guaranteed. Wally never found it, but the door stays open until it does not. And right now, in Massachusetts, in a home with her mother and her son, Alexandra's door is still open. That is the most honest, positive note this story has. Not a fairy tale ending, not a full redemption arc with the credits rolling, not a man who conquered everything and walked into the sunset. Just a door that is still open and 2 people on the other side of it trying to stay there. Sometimes that is the whole victory. Sometimes staying in the room is the entire fight. If this kind of story connects with you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us which part of this hit hardest. More stories like this are coming and you are not going to want to miss them.